And this is the second part of the video where I explain the inner contraptions. And this is about explosions. The explosions happen in different ways from different entities or different mobs and such. TNT's got a blast range of 4, and we will get into what that means. Creepers 3, Charge Creeper 6, Crystal 6, and minecarts have a unique property where their full height determines how strong their blast is going to be. It starts out at 4, similar to a regular TNT, but every single block it falls increases its power, and that number is random. It can fall up to 23 blocks and become the most powerful blast in the game. But yet again, that 0 to 77.5 extra blast is randomized, making Minecart TNT the most powerful and randomized explosion. The things that it needs to be understood about explosions is that it's in 4 parts. You could break it down to more parts than 4, but in general it's 4 parts. I'll go through them quickly and concisely, but they're really important, and every single step is really important. The first thing that happens when a TNT gets primed, or when it gets basically got a redstone signal or anything that just sets it on fire, you can use a flint and steel as well, then the first thing is that TNT primes and turns into an entity. The entity has a shape and size of 0.98 in each direction, and the one important thing to note is that the center of mass of a TNT is at the bottom feet, and the explosion happens 1/16th of a block above the bottom feet, making the blast location a little bit higher. The second really important thing to note is that it always gets an 8 tick fuse, and that the collision of the entity is it doesn't collide with anything. It basically has a non-collidable hitbox. It can go through anything, including other TNT and such, and it doesn't influence any other entities. And the most important thing is that it gets this small little velocity when it's getting primed. It jumps up by 0.2 blocks per tick. A little bit, there is some decimal numbers that I've rounded off. And it also gets this random angle. It chooses a random angle in around the TNT entity, and then it applies a 0.2 blocks speed to that random vector as well. So it basically chooses some random vector, and it ends up being, some of that number is going to end up at the x-axis and some of it at the z-axis, and that 0.2 velocity is going to be divided amongst the two though. And that small velocity is the worst kind of velocity that causes so much problems in many contraptions that got to do with TNT. And it generates this really finicky behavior. And the only way to remove this small micro speed, because most of the speed can end up at the x and some of it at the z-axis. And that's the worst that can happen. And the only way to remove this, eliminate this, is by doing two things. Either the TNT entity, the prime TNT entity, needs to hit a wall, or it needs to be squeezed by pistons against 2 blocks. If you squeeze it, you will eliminate the random speed of the TNT. The second step of the explosion is the raycasts that it generates. That generates 4,000 calculations, and amongst those, only 3,500 of those creates a ray that it generates, and each array is basically the a calculation location, if you want to call it that. I have no idea exactly what word to use for it, but it generates a random number between 0.7 and 1.3 on top of the already blast range, TNT being 4 and Creeper 6 and so on. So the range is between 4 multiplied any number between 0.7 and 1.3. And then whenever this ray is generated, it's generated one at a time. It checks whether this specific ray is inside of a block. If it is inside of a block, then the block will absorb some of that blast. And if the absorption have happened and the ray haven't lost its full power, then that block is put inside of a list that's going to basically delete this block. That's the TNT basically blowing up that block. And these rays then travel at a 0.3 blocks per iteration, not a tick per iteration. It's really important, and it loses a specific amount of power each time it goes further out. And the one important thing is that if it gets absorbed by any block, it's basically 0.3 time plus some absorption number of the block. Each block has its own different absorption number, and if this number is still above 0, the block will be deleted. Otherwise, the block will completely absorb it, and the block will not get deleted. The third step of an explosion is the most important thing when it comes to Pearl alignments and Pearl cannons, basically. One important key thing to note is that TNT, when it blows up, double the amount of blast radius. TNT being 4, it multiplies it by 2, it becomes 8. And you need to add another block to that. So it becomes a 9-block radius around, or a sphere around the TNT that it checks for all the entities around itself. And this sphere, if it's going to have any entity, it will influence them by either damaging them or doing some other stuff to them, pushing them around or such. Unless a specific entity has blast immunity, it's going to get no influence by the TNT. The one thing to note is that any entity, if it's got any block between it and the TNT, it's going to get some of that blast absorbed. It checks there is a raycasting done, expensive raycasting done on each entity that checks how many blocks are between me and that entity, and some of that blast is reduced. And some of the blast resistances, if it's reduced, it influences both the amount of damage and how much the TNT can accelerate that entity. And one other thing, important thing, is that the explosion location is happening on the 1/16th height. Another thing that is really important is that explosions happen on the distance from the feet position of the entity it's influencing. The distance is basically from the center of the from the origin of the explosion to the feet location of the pearl, and the acceleration is placed on the eye height, or the center of mass. It's a bit confusing, but this is how it works. Just how it works. You just have to accept it. That the distance is based on the feet, and the acceleration is based on the eye height. And the TNT explosion can be reduced, mitigated by for example, if you have knockback or blast resistance on your armor, it reduces that acceleration. It also reduces the amount of damage you get from that specific TNT. And the last part of the TNT explosion is the simplest one. It generates the sound, the particles, and then it also determines which blocks that have been put into that specific list will drop blocks, and it will delete all those blocks. So this is really important, because if there was an object here, a blast object here, that was going to get removed, it won't be removed until after the explosion is done. Obviously, if there is two TNT, if the first one will blow it up, and the second one will not see that block in front of it. But if the TNT didn't have like, let's say, blow up in water or something like that, then this object in between the entity, the pearl, and the TNT would not get removed. And another thing to note is that if the TNT blows up in water, it's not going to have any hitboxes blocking it from the pearl. But if it does blow up inside of, let's say, a chest, a ender chest, it doesn't blow up the ender chest, but some of that damage is absorbed.